Hello, welcome to a session on troubleshooting pipelines. So here we'll be going over some tips, tools, and techniques to help you resolve errors within your pipelines. So as your speakers, I'm Austin. I'm a staff engineer and tech lead on one of the pipelines teams. And we also have with us Kunjan, who's an engineering manager for pipelines as well. So before we dive in, I just wanted to give a couple disclaimers or things to keep in mind. So error states are completely normal in complex distributed systems. Everybody runs into them, but there's many things you can do, especially in pipelines, to prevent and triage them. And we'll help you figure out and walk through a few tools you can use to handle these well. This session also doesn't cover channel-specific errors, but rather general tools, techniques, and errors that may apply to all channels and pipelines. But we will show a few demos and guides that we specifically use the QuickBase and JSON handler channels, but these are just for illustrations. So keep in mind that many of these techniques and errors that you see will apply to other channels as well. So by the end of this presentation and this session, we hope you take away 3 main points. So one would be using the troubleshooting tools that we offer within pipelines effectively, such as the activity log, errors, and different pipeline designs. Understanding common categories of errors and how to mitigate them within pipelines. And also understanding the external tools and troubleshooting techniques within pipelines and externally. So let's dive in and start off with the activity page. So before we show you how to use it, let's start off with a use case. So imagine I have a QuickBase app where I have a table called projects. And in this projects table, I store a manager, a name, and a status of the project. And what I want to do using pipelines is whenever a project status is set to completed, I want to copy this record over to this other table and record the completion date, the manager, and the name of that project. The problem, though, is whenever I run this pipeline, the completed projects has no data, or the record that I expected doesn't exist there. So let's use this use case as a way to solve or navigate with some of our tools that we offer within pipelines and figure out how to solve this problem. So the first thing we'll do is we'll navigate the activity page, show you how to use all the tools we offer there. We'll show you how to view activity data and use that to debug your pipeline, and also show you some of the filters and explain what those mean, and also view and understand the different pipeline snapshots or YAMLs that we have. So let's dive in to our demo. In pipelines here, we have, as anybody that you're familiar with in pipelines, we have your list of pipelines. You can also now look into the activity log for all of your pipelines. That's this button at the top. You can also click and view activity for any specific pipeline that you're interested in. And also inside of a pipeline, you can click here to view that pipeline's activity. So let's dive into the activity here. So just to give you a brief overview, so every activity, which is essentially recording each step in your pipeline or branch or loop. And what you can do here is you can actually see within each step or activity, you can look at the inputs and outputs of that step. So if we look at this record created, for instance, I can look at what was the input values, what did I expect to come in, and when the record was updated in this case, what was the data that was sent back from QuickBase. And with all this, I can use this data to help figure out what's going on. And then I can, step A is the record updated, and then it goes to my branch, my if condition. So I can see what data was then passed into this if condition or another step that I have in my pipeline. So let's dive into our pipeline itself. Again, in our use case, I mentioned whenever a record is updated, I want to check if the status is completed and then create a record in my second table. But again, like I mentioned, in my use case, I wasn't seeing the record be created. So there's a couple things to keep in mind here. So in the activity, not only can you see each steps, activity inputs and outputs, but you can also filter by this runs activity. So this is important to keep in mind that whenever a pipeline is run or executed, it creates what's called a pipeline run. And this allows you, if you click on this, you can narrow down your activity just to the context of that run of that pipeline. That way, if you wanted to check what is the data coming in step A and what was step B doing, you know you're not looking at multiple runs of your pipeline. The other things I wanted to show and mention was these filters that we have in the activity log, where you can view branches, failures, operations, pollers, queries, errors, throttling, which I'll explain in a little bit. But there's just all these tools that can help you narrow down your search even further. So in this case, I said the record isn't created. So this run, we see there's no create record step happening. So we can look at this branch condition here. So we have an if condition within our pipeline. Again, if I jump back here, it says whenever a status is completed. So if I look at the output here, I can actually see in this if condition what it was comparing. So I see if it's equal or is, and I see complete here, but I expected completed, but I actually received complete. So this actually shows that there was a typo probably in the pipeline at this time when this ran that caused this to fail. So let's review. So the activity page, I mentioned the filters that we have in the activity. So again, there's three main categories. So you can think of these as step activities, which include the branches that I showed you, the operations, which is essentially step activity, succeeded operations, which is just a narrower filter of that, queries, which includes the search or query steps. And then there's another category called info, which includes when your pipeline was started or finished. Notes that include, more behind the scenes information about how your pipeline was executed, such as if it's run in parallel or the step was asynchronous. Or if you're the different poller activity, if you have any channels that are running with pollers, you can actually view the poller activity here. That's not directly tied to a pipeline. And then the last category has to do with warnings or errors, such as failures, which are errors that cause the step to completely fail that can't be retried. There's throttling, which is if your pipeline exceeds limits that we have within pipelines. And then there's also transient errors, which are intermittent errors, those things that can be retried multiple times, such as rate limiting or another intermittent error. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the pipeline YAML. So pipeline definitions, whenever you create a pipeline and you can export it, the format when we export it is this format called YAML. So YAML, the actual definition is YAML 8 markup language. It's a little bit of a play on words, but basically this is just a data serialization language typically used to store configurations. And in this case, this is just the configuration of your pipeline. So if you look here, you can actually see that the pipeline itself, when I created it and I export it, I can actually view the whole pipeline in this raw YAML format. So in this pipeline activity, though, you can also view the pipeline summary. And this is essentially the same thing. But what's important to note here is this is the captured YAML definition at that point in time. So you can actually click this and historically view what the pipeline looked like when that step was executed. And you can use these to compare and see what went wrong, if somebody changed something and now your pipeline isn't working. And all this is, you can actually take this and then import it as a new pipeline if you wanted to. But in this case, we can actually use these definitions. And if we click on the view pipeline summary on a run that actually succeeded in the past, I can actually see what was the correct version of this pipeline. And here, if you look closely, you can see if the status is completed, ran successfully, where in that other run I showed you where it didn't run step B, the status was set to complete. So that caused it to not actually run step B. So those are some of the things that we wanted to show you about the activity page. So there's lots of other different tools, but this gives you a general idea of how to navigate it, how to view the activity data, how to filter by all the things we offer to help you narrow down your search for what went wrong, and also how to view and understand the pipeline snapshots and how to use those to your advantage. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kunjan to go over some common types of errors in pipelines.
Thank you, Austin. So in this section, we will go over some common type of errors that we may see, and we'll go deeper into some foundational topics, introduce some core concepts, and some mitigation strategies for those errors. And as Austin pointed out, we will not focus on channel-specific errors. These are mainly errors that you may see in any kind of a channel, and we will only use QuickBase channel for more illustration purposes. So broadly speaking, we categorize errors into dynamic or design time errors or runtime errors. Now, design time errors, we will focus on data types and why they're really important in pipelines, and some of the pitfalls that people run into when referencing one type of data and mistaking it for another type of data. And we'll also introduce this concept of a context and a scope, and why referencing data in certain contexts is really important and be really mindful of them. And in the later half, we will go over some runtime errors. And in those, we will introduce concept of transient errors and some remote errors. So let's dive right in. So first and foremost, pipelines is a typed system. We care about types a lot. So it's very important to be observant about the data types when you reference them in a Jinja function, or when you pass them from one step to another step, or when you pass them from one system to another system. And these are the kinds of data types that we have. So we have these number types and string types and Booleans. And it's really important to be careful about the differences between one and the other. So we will go deeper into some pitfalls on mistaking number versus string, and a list of records versus a single record. So let's consider a case. Let's say we have the years stored in QuickBase somewhere, and we want to take those years and add them to the current time, and then get a new time out of it. And I do know the years in QuickBase is a number, but it comes off as represented as a string. So this quotation of a 1. Now, I looked at a help documentation, and I found this delta function, which works for me. And I use the time.now, the current time, and add the delta of the years to the current time now, expecting to get a new time with the years added to it. But when I tried it out, I got an error, and it in the activity log. Now, it's clear that I need to convert the string that was returned into an integer so that Jinja function works for me. And in Jinja, we have all these filters called ints and strings and lists, and all the data types have similar filters, and treat them just like in QuickBase when we have two numbers or two texts. So that was the problem before. We had a time.now, and it was taking a years, and it threw an error. When I converted it to an integer and cast it, it works. So this is, again, just an illustration of an example. It's a trivial example, but it speaks to why data types are important. These types are implicit in these functions, in these Jinja functions or external systems, and being mindful of what they really expect and sending it the correct data type is really important. And using this casting or Jinja cast operators will make it less error prone. Similar to how we may confuse, let's say, a number to a string, another example of why data types are important we've seen are people mistaking list to a record. So you have a list of records versus a single record, and being mindful of whether you're operating with a collection of those versus a single record is really important. Now, let's say we have a search record that is piped to a create record. Now, I do know the search records, the green pipe returns a list, whereas a update or create step works on a single record. Now, when I sequence them and a.id, ID isn't present in a list. So when I send it to QuickBase, I got a missing required value. Now, it could be in other contexts, when you're setting in Salesforce or QuickBooks, you could have similar error messages come out. And it is because we are sending a list to a single record, and the attribute ID doesn't exist. Now, what I need to do is I need to extract the single record from a list. And in pipelines we use in the Jinjas, we have the square bracket that lets you index a single record from a list of records. And it's 0th index, just like in Python. So when you say a.0 and you say an ID of that, you get an ID of the first record. And a.1 gives you an ID of the second record. So this way, if you sequence a search records to a create and still reference index a single record out of a list, this will be less error prone. Now, you may be wondering, why do we even allow a search pipe to be sequenced to a blue pipe? Like if it's more error prone, why do we even allow it? Now, there are some exceptions when we do that. And this is an example, and there could be other use cases, but let's say we are trying to create an invoice of multiple line items. And those line items are stored in QuickBase. Now, when we search records and let's say we retrieve all those line items, we do know a green pipe is returning me a list. And when I sequence those records, those collections to another list, in this context is those line items, it can work. When I map them correctly, pipelines will figure out that, yes, I'm operating on a list and I'm sending it to a list and it works. But the context here is that it's clear in the UI that it is a list. And keeping these things in mind, whether it's a list or it's an integer or whether it's a function, all these things are really important when you sequence data from one to the other. And being mindful of that makes your pipeline less error prone. Now that we've covered a lot of those data type errors, let's switch gears into the context in which the data can be referenced and why it really matters in pipelines. So in pipelines, you may notice that you cannot reference data from one pipeline to another one. So the data is context within the pipeline. Similarly, within the loop and a conditional statements like if, those data are scoped within it. And referencing it outside is incorrect. And you have to be very careful about when you're referencing it outside. Now, let's take an example. Let's say you have a search records and you have a create record within it, the B step. And now anything that C does to reference B directly, let's say if you say b.text, will be incorrect. And the only way a C can reference B is to either do a lookup again to an external system or to use these global containers like bucket channels to reference it and then to pass things around. Now, use as a bucket is beyond the scope of this session, and I highly encourage people to look at Empower sessions as well as documentations about how to use it effectively. But keeping in mind about where the data is created and how it's referenced and how it's scoped is really important for us to write the correct pipeline. Now that we've seen all these design time errors, let's switch gear into runtime errors. And in this, we will cover two distinct error types. We will cover transient errors or temporary errors that may happen in pipeline, as well as some remote errors, as opposed to errors that pipeline itself may throw. In pipelines, we do have the concept of a non-transient and a transient error. And transient errors are those errors that are really temporary in pipelines, that are happening momentarily, but pipeline really tries to recover from it. So there's no need to panic right away. And an example of that is, let's say you have a search records that is sequenced to an update record. And let's say the search records is now returning you thousands and thousands of records. For some reason, either you mistyped the queries or something happened. Now, when you make an update record in this context to QuickBase, we will send in thousands of requests to QuickBase through this single pipeline. And the QuickBase app, allowing only so many requests per second, will tell pipelines to back off up for a bit. And as you can see in the activity log, it is clearly labeled as transient error retries. And we say that we will retry this after 12 times with a back off of around 5,000 milliseconds. So pipelines will really try its best to retry up to 12 times. And so it's a really transient state of the world, and it's a temporary error, as opposed to, say, something just really blocked, as we were seeing previously with the ginger errors or those data type errors. Now, even though there is no need to panic for transient error, there are ways to mitigate it. And in this context, it's really when the system is throttling the request, right? And it could be in any other systems like Salesforce or QuickBooks have their own limits on how many requests you could make, and it could result in transient errors. So a solution for that is, instead of making a lot of requests to these external systems, make a single request. And in QuickBase, we do offer a bulk operation, and there are buckets channels similarly that will let you do the same concepts here. So this will let you only make a single request for all the records that we've retrieved, avoiding many requests to the external system and avoiding throttling errors. And this will be a way to get over the transient errors. Now, even though let's say you've designed the pipeline well and everything is great, since you're talking with remote systems, there are ways that you may cause errors in those remote systems. And they will be prefixed very clearly in the activity log as remote system reported an error that we were trying to run. And now, pipeline inevitably will run into them. And we do provide all kinds of tools and techniques to help you diagnose them. And Austin will go over a lot of them. But I wanted to cover a bulk of, like I said, the foundation for what those runtime errors in the remote system could look like. But we do try to present a very user-friendly message, but unfortunately, these status codes could get revealed in the activity log. So keeping this translation handy, first and foremost, is really important for us to get to a correct pipeline. So let's go over some of them. 400 errors are caused when there are bad requests that you're sending to an external system. Now, it could be because you made a syntactical error in your request, or you're expecting certain type of data in this request, and you send in another one. Now, we advise you to check the structure, and there are these external tools like jsonlint.com that will let you validate whether a JSON is correct. 403, if you see that in your activity log, really means that there is an authorization error. And it could be because, say, your password has expired, or your token is not correct, or some permissions that you have in these external systems is not correct. So, or it could also be that your headers that you've sent are incorrectly being passed. And it's really important for us to look at what is happening at the user permission level context. 404 is usually when there's nothing found in the remote system. And we've seen that when, let's say, there is genuinely nothing found, and you're trying to, let's say, update a record that is not present, or it could also just be because you've mistyped the URL, or let's say instead of sending an ID that the external system wants, you're sending in an email address. So there's no resource for that URL. 421.9 is our friend that we just saw, which is the rate-limited transient error. And there are, as we pointed out, using bucket channels or QuickBase's bulk operations are ways to avoid these rate-limited 429 errors. And lastly, we get 500 errors, which are really things that the remote system is not presenting us with right set of messages, and we just don't know what happened. And in this context, unfortunately, you will have to look at the documentations and see if there's anything, look at or talk to a support representative of Salesforce or QuickBooks to find out what really happened. It could be a bug in these external systems. It could be the service is down. And it's beyond the scope of now a pipeline designer to diagnose this. So in this section, we cover a lot of type of errors, and this should hopefully set a foundation for diagnosing any kind of an error that you may see in pipeline, whether it's data type errors that we saw and mistaking one data type to another, or it could also be scoping error, and referencing data beyond the scope could cause an error. We also saw a concept of temporary errors or transient errors. And even though we say that there's no need to panic, went through some mitigation strategies for it. And lastly, we touched on a little bit on the remote kind of errors and systems that could report errors outside and report it to pipelines. Now, in the next section, Austin will go deeper into these remote errors and some tools and techniques as well to cover and fix all these errors.
Great, thanks, Kunjan. So now I'll be going over a few more tools and techniques to help you solve some more complex problems with your pipelines, such as some of the things that Kunjan had mentioned. So let's dive in. So the tools and techniques topics that we'll be covering in this section include external tools. So some tools that you can use that are outside of pipelines to help you solve your various problems, such as remote errors and things like that. There's also some techniques to help you narrow down the error that you're receiving or seeing in your activity without touching your production data. And also, we'll go over 2 specific use cases for how to apply these various tools and techniques to solve these problems. So let's dive in with the first use case. So let's go over in a scenario where I'm receiving a remote API error. So in that same app that we talked about previously, so I have this projects table that has the name, manager, and status. And what I want to do is I want to run a report that I have that gets the total number of projects that each manager has, and then adds that value to this completed projects table. That way, in this completed projects, I can see when was each of the projects completed, and for each of those managers that completed that project, like what's their workload, how many total projects do they have? And the problem I'm receiving is this remote API error that Kunjan had briefly mentioned. So this bad request, which is fairly generic. So let's dive in and show you a demo here. So let's look at my pipeline that I have set up for this. So you may be familiar with the JSON channel we have. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually making a request to the QuickBase developer APIs, where I'll run a report that I mentioned to get this value that I'm interested in, run over the JSON records that are coming back, and then go through them and add them to my QuickBase table or update those records in that final table. But if I look at my activity here, this is the problem that I'm receiving right away. So right when I try to fetch this JSON resource, I'm getting this remote service reported an error, bad request. And I can, like I mentioned before, I can actually look in this input and output here. I can see what are the headers, what's the URL that I'm making a request to. But other than that, there's not a lot of information here that can help me. And again, this may not be just a QuickBase API. This may be some other API you're working with that we don't have channel support with. So keep in mind that this will work for, this may happen with any API that you're interacting with. So what can we do here? So one suggestion we always typically try to guide people toward is first take a look at the documentation for the API you're working with, if it has any. So in this case, of course, the QuickBase developer APIs, we have a lot of documentation here that can help you learn and figure out how to interact with this API. So this would be the first step. So obviously I've gone through and set up some of this. So I can see what are the parameters that I need, what's the URL, what are headers that I need to pass in as part of the request. So let's go back to our pipeline here. So, sorry, this pipeline, where I make this fetch JSON request. So if I look in here, I can see here's the headers that I'm passing in, here's the URL that I'm passing in. So it looks like I have pretty much everything all set up, but there's still this problem. So the next thing we suggest people to try is an external tool that will allow you to make this API request outside of the scope of pipelines. So basically not interacting with pipelines at all. Let's see what this API is returning so I can try to figure out this problem in a more generic fashion. So this is where a tool such as Postman would come in. So this is just an example. There are other tools that do this, but this is just something that we use that can help solve these types of problems. So again, I'm basically doing the same thing that I'm doing in pipelines where I have the URL, I have the headers that I want. But when I make this request, you can see a little more detail here. So I see required header authorization is not specified. So if I look at my headers, it looks like I have authentication instead of authorization. So I can actually test that out right away in Postman, make this request, and see what comes back. And it looks like I'm actually getting the data that I want now. So that's probably the simple fix. That's probably exactly what is happening in my pipeline. So if I switch back, I can look over here and it looks like I had the same problem. I had authentication instead of authorization. So I could make this change and my pipeline I would expect would run successfully. So that's the first use case. So now that we've fixed that or seen what the error is, here are some of the tools that will help you in more use cases than the one we just described. So as I mentioned, the QuickBase Developer API portal is a perfect place to help you solve problems with the QuickBase APIs like I used in that use case. But there's other tools from other third parties such as Microsoft or Google. If you're using an API there, they have their own sandboxes or developer portals to help you test out these APIs and play around with them. So we suggest taking that as a first step, making sure everything is lined up, making sure the permissions are correct. And once you get that running, you can then use that information and pull it over into your pipeline. And as I mentioned, for making requests, Postman is a perfect example. There are also others if you want to test out the calling these APIs directly. And then inversely for receiving requests. So if say you had in your pipeline a call a webhook step, you can actually use request bin as a kind of a test area where you can actually receive this webhook call, see what the data is coming through, and play around with it there. And just to recap on our solution in this use case, so again, we looked through some of the activity. We saw what the remote API error was, and you can clearly now see that the root of the problem for our bad request response was this header was incorrect. And we can easily see that through something like Postman or another external tool. And this was our solution just to fix that header. So for the second use case, which is actually a review of our first use case that we showed you earlier on in this session. So again, we have this projects table where we have the name, manager, and status. And all we wanted to do at that point was copy the records whenever the project was completed into this second table that we have to record the name, the manager, and the completion date of that project. But again, the problem that we had was the completed project has no data, or at least the record that we expected didn't come over. So the question I'm proposing now is, say I want to test this and test my pipeline logic, the conditions, whatever I want to do, without actually impacting or touching my production data. So now we have this pipeline here that I mentioned. So if we go back to the first use case where I have this record created trigger, and then I have this branch that says when the status is completed, and then I do a create record step. What we can actually do now is replace all of these channel specific steps with these more generic channels such as webhooks or JSON to do all these tests that we want without actually creating records in QuickBase or waiting for a real record to be created in QuickBase to test this pipeline out. So what I did here as an example was I replaced the trigger by creating a new pipeline with a webhook where I can actually just use something like I showed you before, like Postman, to make a request to it with some data that I want to test with. And then I have my if condition, which is essentially the same thing as I had in the other pipeline where I said the status is completed. And then I can have a third step, which this replaces that update step at the end, or the create record step, where I can make a request out to something like request bin, as we show here as an example, to see what's the data getting sent out from this step. And this essentially allows me to see the full end-to-end picture of what's going on. So again, if we go back to the incoming request and I go over to Postman, I can actually see here's the URL that I'm making to pipelines with some data. And if I go back here, I can look at the activity and see, okay, I've received a request. Again, with this data that I just sent over, I can test my logic, such as this if condition as a simple example. What exactly is going on? What do the comparisons look like? Do I have any typos? And then again, the last step would be making that request out to request bin, which is essentially testing out the create record step, where I can send over the same data that I want to send to QuickBase, but instead I'm sending it over to request bin. And when I send it, I can actually see like, okay, here's the data that's coming through. And now I can kind of see the full end-to-end picture. Is this exactly what I expect? So again, just to recap, so this is how one strategy or one technique to test with test data rather than your production data. So what we did here, and this is a more extreme example, you can just take one of these if you want, but basically you can replace your triggers with an incoming webhook request, which will allow you to see, okay, let's not wait for a real production data to get created first. Like we can actually just do this on demand. And then we can replace any of the other steps, such as a create record or an update record, with these make request steps and send that data out to something like request bin. And that way we can do the full end-to-end. We can trigger the pipeline with request bin with Postman, like we have here on the left, view the pipeline activity itself in the center, and then see the end result in request bin. So this allows you to see the full end-to-end picture without touching your production data at all. So just to have some takeaways, so these were some examples and some use cases for showing different tools and techniques you can use to help you solve your pipeline's errors. So it's important to keep in mind that pipeline's errors manifest for many different reasons. And in this section, we hope you learned how to use these tools and resources to help solve these problems that you may encounter, including QuickBase tools and documentation specifically, external tools, resources such as the developer portals that other APIs may have, and also different techniques for how to isolate and troubleshoot the errors you have in your pipelines without actually touching your production data. We also wanted to make you aware of some additional resources that you can use. So one is the community Slack page we have. So there's this channel called Pipelines where you can ask various questions about, you're having some problem and you can get input from other users of pipelines. There's also a few other Empower sessions to keep in mind. This Empower that we have. So one is Becoming a Jinja Ninja, which is a workshop. There's also Integration Toolbox, Choosing the Right Tool for the Job, which is another workshop. And then there's Pipelines, How to Use Built-in Channels, which you can view on demand. And one other resource for those who aren't too familiar with Postman, we actually do have a previous webinar that someone at QuickBase went over to talk through how to use Postman or external tools for integrations with QuickBase. So throughout this session, we hope, again, you took away some key things. So one would be troubleshooting tools with pipelines and how to use that effectively. Also, on how to understand common categories of errors, data types, and how to mitigate these errors. And also, what are some various external tools and troubleshooting techniques that can be used to solve some of these. And before we get to Q&A, I just wanted to thank you and everyone here for your time and ask that you share your feedback and rate this session. Also, if you have any questions later, my name is Austin, and we also have Kunjan here. So feel free to head over to QuickBase Community Slack, Empower session channel we have, and mention us if you have any questions. Thank you.